Sergeant Jack Morrison had been counting the seconds. 7 minutes now. 7 minutes his men had been sitting exposed on a narrow road in France, watching a German-held ridgeline somewhere ahead, while an American colonel argued with his driver over a map. 7 minutes was nothing in ordinary life. In combat, it was the difference between arriving at an objective while the enemy was still vulnerable and arriving after they had time to prepare. It was August 9th, 1944. The country between Caen and Falaise in Normandy. The bocage, those dense, maddening hedgerows that had slowed every Allied advance to a crawl since D-Day, was finally behind them. They were in open ground now, where speed was everything and sitting still could get you killed. Morrison's company from the South Saskatchewan Regiment was supposed to link up with armor and hit a German position 5 kilometers up the road. Intelligence said it was lightly held but strategically important. The window to take it before it could be reinforced was closing, and it was closing faster by the minute. Morrison was 32 years old, which made him old for an infantryman. He had fought in the First War as a teenager, gone back to his family's farm in Saskatchewan in the 20s, and signed up again in 1939 because here he had seen it coming and knew they would need men who already understood what war actually was. He had landed at Juno Beach on D-Day. He had fought through the bocage. He wore his sergeant's stripes because he was good at his job and because he had survived when others had not. He also had a reputation for not tolerating waste. That was why his captain had chosen him for this particular movement. It was a job that needed to be done quickly and cleanly. The American colonel was still arguing. Morrison could catch fragments of the conversation drifting back on the wind. Something about the map being wrong. Something about the route they had been given. Something about needing to contact division headquarters before proceeding. The colonel looked young for his rank, early 30s maybe. His uniform was immaculate. His hands, when he gestured at the map, looked like they had never done physical labor. Morrison's company numbered about 80 men. They had started with 120. 2 months of fighting had reduced them. The survivors were spread along the road in the practiced way of soldiers who had learned to survive, staying low in the shallow ditches on either side, using whatever cover the ground offered, watching the tree line ahead with the specific alertness of men who know they are being looked at. Every minute they sat here was another minute for German observers in those hills to plot their position. Another minute for someone to pick up a telephone and call in artillery coordinates. Another minute for a road that was a route to become a killing ground. 8 minutes. Morrison looked back at his men. He could read it in their posture, the tight shoulders, the stiff stillness, the way they kept glancing at him. They were waiting for him to do something. So he did. He walked toward the American jeep, boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped a few feet from the colonel. The colonel looked up. His expression was the particular blend of irritation and indifference that certain officers produced when interrupted by lower ranks. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" The way he said the word made his feelings about the interruption plain. "Yes, sir," Morrison said. "You can get out of my way." The colonel's face went red. "Excuse me? You're blocking the road, sir. My company needs to pass. We have a timed objective, and we're already running behind." The colonel straightened to his full height. He had 6 inches on Morrison at least. "I'm coordinating with my headquarters, Sergeant. You will wait until I'm finished." Morrison understood how the Army worked. Rank mattered. Command structures mattered. Respecting officers was not optional. But he also understood something that desk officers sometimes forgot, that in combat, the rules existed to serve the mission, not the other way around. When following the rules was killing the mission, something had to give. "Sir, with respect, we don't have time to wait," Morrison said. "There's a German position 5 kilometers up this road. We need to take it before they can reinforce it. Every minute we sit here is a minute they use to get ready. I'm asking you politely, move your vehicle." The colonel's face shifted from red toward something darker. "You're asking me? You're a sergeant talking to a colonel. You don't ask me for anything. You follow orders, and I'm ordering you to stay here until I'm ready to move." Morrison looked at the man. The clean uniform, the map in his hands with their position clearly marked on it. The jeep blocking the only road forward for no reason, beyond the fact that this officer was lost or unsure or simply unaware of how badly he was exposing 80 infantrymen to observation. He thought about his men lying in those ditches. He thought about the objective. He thought about every officer he had served under across 2 wars, the good ones and the poor ones, and he decided. "Sir, I'm going to explain something to you," Morrison said, keeping his voice level. "I've been fighting Germans for 2 months in this campaign and 6 months in Italy before that." "You arrived, what? 3 weeks ago? A month? You're lost on a road that's clearly marked on your own map. You're blocking the advance of an entire company while my men sit exposed to artillery observation. So I've tried being respectful. Now here's the reality. I'm going to accomplish my mission. That mission requires moving down this road in the next 60 seconds. You can move your jeep voluntarily, or my men can move it for you. But either way, we're getting through." The silence that followed was complete. Morrison's men, watching from the ditches, had gone absolutely still. The colonel's driver was staring at Morrison with wide eyes. Even the birds had stopped. The colonel found his voice, and it was shaking. "You're threatening a superior officer. That's insubordination. That's court-martial material. I'll have you up on charges so fast." "Then do it," Morrison said. "After we take the after my men are safe, after the mission is done, you can court-martial me all you want. But first, get out of my way." A long moment passed. Morrison watched the calculation happen behind the colonel's eyes. He could push this. He could order Morrison arrested on the spot. He could make it about authority and hierarchy, and what happens when a sergeant forgets his place. Or he could acknowledge that the man standing in front of him had been doing this for months, knew the ground and the enemy and the clock in ways that a staff officer 3 weeks in the theater did not, and that the mission was going to be damaged further with every additional second they stood here. The colonel made his choice. "You'll regret this, Sergeant. When this is over, I'm filing a formal complaint with your chain of command. You are finished. Noted, sir. Move your jeep." The colonel gestured angrily to his driver. The driver started the engine and pulled the vehicle to the side of the road. Morrison turned without another word and waved his company forward. 80 Canadian infantrymen moved past the American jeep in tactical formation, weapons ready, moving with the efficiency of soldiers who had done exactly this many times before. Morrison didn't look back. He had made his decision, said what needed to be said, and now he had a mission to complete. If they survived the next few hours, he would deal with the consequences. If they didn't survive, consequences would be irrelevant. The company moved quickly through open ground, covering the distance with the purposeful pace of experienced infantry. Morrison's mind shifted entirely to the tactical problem ahead. A German position dug in around a crossroads, estimated platoon strength, machine guns, probably a mortar or two. The plan called for concentrated mortar fire first, then a two-platoon assault, with the third providing suppressing fire from the flank. Standard, straightforward, the kind of operation they had executed dozens of times. The difference between success and failure would be timing and execution. They reached the assembly area 20 minutes later, linked up with the armor that had been waiting, and launched the assault. It went the way these things always went, chaotic and violent and terrifying, and ultimately successful. The German position held for 30 minutes before the survivors retreated eastward. Morrison's company took 8 casualties, 3 killed, 5 wounded. The Germans lost twice that and left the position in Allied hands. Mission accomplished. Morrison was organizing the consolidation, establishing defensive perimeters, seeing to the wounded, checking ammunition distribution, when a captain arrived from battalion headquarters. He was Canadian, from the Regiment de la Chaudière, and his expression occupied the space between amused and concerned. Sergeant Morrison, "Sir, I've been asked to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed against you by a Colonel Brennan of the United States First Army. The complaint alleges insubordination, threatening a superior officer, and conduct unbecoming. You're to report to Major Patterson at battalion headquarters immediately." Morrison nodded. He had expected this. "Can I finish setting up the defensive position first?" The captain's expression shifted slightly toward amused. "I think you'd better, Sergeant. Major Patterson is going to want to know the objective was secured before he deals with whatever you've started." Morrison spent another hour making sure his company was properly dug in, the wounded evacuated, observation posts established and manned. Then he handed command to his lieutenant and rode back to battalion headquarters in the captain's jeep. Major Patterson was a professional soldier in his mid-40s who had commanded a company in the First War and worked his way through the ranks to battalion operations officer the slow and legitimate way. He was fair, thoroughly competent, and notoriously unmoved by excuses from any quarter. He looked up when Morrison entered the corner of the requisitioned farmhouse that served as his office. "Sergeant Morrison, I've received an interesting complaint. Would you like to explain what happened?" Morrison gave a concise account: the blocked road, the timed mission, the colonel's refusal to move, the confrontation, the outcome. Patterson listened without interrupting. When Morrison finished, the major was quiet for a moment. "Do you know who Colonel Brennan is?" "No, sir. Just that he's American and significantly outranks me. He's on General Bradley's staff. Logistics planning. He was sent to verify road conditions and map accuracy for upcoming operations." Patterson paused. "Which means you publicly dressed down a member of the First Army Commander's personal staff." Morrison absorbed this. "I didn't know that, sir. But it wouldn't have changed what I did." "No, I don't imagine it would have." Patterson opened a folder on his desk. "Your after-action report indicates you took the objective with minimal casualties and successfully disrupted German defensive preparations in that sector. Your lieutenant confirms this. The armor commander you linked up with filed a separate report commending your company's effectiveness. We did our job, sir." "You did. You also created a diplomatic incident. Patterson closed the folder. The Americans want disciplinary action. Brennan's chain of command has formally requested it. Morrison stood at attention and kept his face neutral. What are my orders, sir? Your orders are to return to your company and continue doing your job. Patterson's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. I've informed the Americans that while your tone was perhaps unnecessarily direct, your tactical judgment was sound and your mission was accomplished. I've also suggested that their colonel might benefit from additional training in land navigation before his next field inspection. Morrison could not entirely suppress a reaction to that. That's all, Sergeant. Dismissed. Patterson paused. And Morrison, next time you need to correct an Allied officer, try to choose one who isn't on the Army commander's personal staff. I'll do my best, sir. Word of the incident spread through the battalion before Morrison had returned to his company, and from the battalion outward through the division with the particular velocity that soldier stories achieve when they involve an NCO, telling an officer exactly what he thinks. The fact that it was a Canadian sergeant and an American colonel gave it international texture. Canadian soldiers called to Morrison as he passed to ask if the story was true. Some American enlisted men nodded at him with undisguised respect. A handful of American officers gave him the kind of look that indicated they had heard the story and were not delighted by it. The bigger surprise came a week later when the company was pulled back briefly from the fighting around the Falaise Gap. Morrison was summoned to a meeting with Brigadier General Rod Keller, commander of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Keller was a combat veteran of the First War, aggressive and occasionally controversial, respected by his men for the directness that sometimes made his superiors uncomfortable. He gestured to a chair when Morrison entered. "Sit down, Sergeant. I wanted to meet the man who's become famous for telling an American colonel to move his vehicle." Morrison sat. "Sir, I was trying to accomplish the mission." "I know. I've read the reports." Keller leaned forward. "What you did was tactically sound and operationally necessary. It was also politically awkward, which is why I'm talking to you rather than sending a memo. Let me explain something about this campaign. We're operating alongside the Americans, the British, the Poles, various other contingents. That coalition is strong, but it's also delicate. We need those relationships. I understand, sir, but I'm not finished." Keller's tone was not unkind. "We also need to maintain our own standards. Canadian forces have a reputation for effectiveness, for not letting delays accumulate, for doing what needs to be done. That reputation is part of why we're given the operational responsibilities we carry despite our numbers. What you did with Colonel Brennan, putting the mission ahead of procedural comfort, that's consistent with how this Army operates." He paused. "You assessed the situation. You made a judgment. You acted. And you were right. So I'm not being punished, sir. You're not being punished. You're also not being promoted or decorated. There are situations where doing the right thing doesn't come with official recognition, because officially you were insubordinate to a superior officer. Unofficially," Keller allowed himself a slight pause, "unofficially, every senior Canadian officer in this division understands exactly what you did and why. And unofficially, I wish I had been there to see his face." Morrison allowed himself to relax slightly. "Rank should command respect," Keller continued, "but it should be earned respect, not automatic deference based on insignia. That's a flaw in the system, and it's a flaw every experienced soldier runs into eventually. He stood, signaling the meeting was concluding. "Carry on, Sergeant." Morrison returned to his company and found that the story had taken on a life he had no control over. In the way of all soldier stories, it had been improved with distance. In some versions, Morrison had physically moved the Jeep himself. In others, he had drawn his sidearm. In a version circulating through at least one American regiment, there had been a physical confrontation requiring intervention. None of this was accurate, but it served its purpose. It gave men something to discuss besides the relentless grinding danger of the Falaise fighting. It reinforced, for Canadian soldiers, a particular idea about who they were. But the incident had effects beyond morale. American officers who heard the story, even those who found the humiliation of one of their own distasteful, could not avoid acknowledging that Morrison had been right about the tactical situation. The mission had been time-sensitive. The delay had been unjustified. The Canadian sergeant had read the ground correctly and acted accordingly. This fed into a growing operational understanding between American and Canadian commands. Canadian units were not subordinates to be directed, but partners to be coordinated with. That understanding would shape how the two armies worked together through the rest of the campaign in Northwest Europe. For Colonel Brennan, the incident was professionally embarrassing, but not career-ending. He remained on Bradley's staff. His formal complaint against Morrison was never formally withdrawn, but it was never pursued past the initial filing. Someone in his chain of command had likely made the quiet calculation that pressing charges against a sergeant for correctly identifying a time-sensitive tactical problem would draw more attention to the colonel's conduct than to Morrison's. Morrison served with the regiment through the liberation of Belgium and Holland, was eventually promoted to warrant officer in recognition of his experience and the quality of his leadership, and came home to Saskatchewan after the war. He ran his farm until his death in 1973. He rarely discussed the war, in the way common to men of his generation, but occasionally, when pressed by younger family members who wanted to hear something from those years, he would tell the story of the American colonel and the blocked road. He always insisted on the same interpretation. It was not about disrespecting Americans. It was not about proving anything about Canadian soldiers versus anyone else. It was about doing what the mission required when the clock was running. The Army runs on rules and rank, he would say, but sometimes you have to use judgment about when following the rules serves the mission and when it's working against it. That's what leadership actually is, knowing the difference, whether you're a private or a general. He would also acknowledge, when pressed, that he could probably have handled it more diplomatically. He had tried diplomacy first. It had not worked. When time ran out, he got direct. You have to know when to be subtle and when to say exactly what you mean. He would explain, subtle takes time. We didn't have time. So I said what needed to be said and dealt with what came afterward. The incident became part of the teaching material at Canadian NCO leadership courses in the post-war years. Here was a situation where a sergeant had to make a judgment call under genuine pressure. Here was what he decided. Here was what resulted. Different instructors drew different lessons. Morrison's willingness to accept personal consequences, his accurate reading of the tactical timeline, the political complications of correcting an Allied officer, the fundamental question of when rules serve the mission and when they hinder it. But the thread running through every interpretation was the same. Morrison had been in a genuinely difficult position, had handled it in a way that accomplished the mission and protected his men, and had faced the consequences without flinching. That was the job of a combat leader at every rank. The story endured because it captured something specific about how Canadian forces operated in the Second World War. They were a relatively small military contribution to a coalition dominated by powers of vastly greater size. They compensated for that through professionalism, tactical aggression, and an institutional unwillingness to let obstacles, including human ones, interrupt the accomplishment of a mission. That combination earned them operational responsibilities and a reputation that their numbers alone would not have justified. Morrison's confrontation with Colonel Brennan was one moment among millions in a 6-year war. But it illustrated the principle clearly: mission first, obstacle second, paperwork afterward. Rank commanded respect, but not at the expense of the objective. Authority was legitimate until it became an obstacle, and when it became an obstacle, the Canadian answer was straightforward: get out of the way and let the professionals work. That approach created friction on occasion. It also created results, which, when the stakes were as high as they were and the margin for error as thin, was ultimately the only measure that mattered.